We are here to have a conversation based on a newly released book, Nietzsche's Narcissism. There's another video on this channel which deals with this book, and I have the honor of talking to the author. This is not an interview. This is a conversation or a talk, and we will try to make sense of Nietzsche's life, Nietzsche's personality, and if possible even Nietzsche's ideas and their impact, or alleged and real. But I would like to open by proposing a thesis and then hear what you have to say. I created a mental map of about 100 influential public intellectuals, and I divided them taxonomically. I divided them in three groups. The public intellectuals who follow the zeitgeist or reify the zeitgeist. Yeah. The public intellectuals, and those would include Nietzsche, those would include Jordan Peterson, and so on and so forth. They represent the zeitgeist. Then you have the public intellectuals who plagiarize, and these would include, for example, Sigmund Freud. Bulk of Sigmund Freud's work has been plagiarized, believe it or not. And then you would have the public intellectuals who truly innovate, groundbreakers, pioneers, and so on and so forth. And I found out something pretty shattering. If you belong in the first two groups, you are very, very likely to be idolized and included in the Encyclopedia Britannica, let alone Wikipedia. But if you belong in the third group, you're extremely unlikely to have any impact whatsoever, or remembered even. Sooner or later, someone will come along, and that person will plagiarize your innovative, pioneering work and will become known for it. But you, as the originator, will vanish from the pages of history. Do you have the feeling that in your work, do you have the feeling that Nietzsche was kind of surfing the zeitgeist? Or do you have a feeling that he was an innovator?
It is not only my opinion that the ideas that he presented were largely already present at that time, second half of the 19th century. He was known for not putting references in his work. Very rarely, I make a point of this. And in that sense, most of his works cannot be considered scholarly, actually, because he rarely even puts arguments, literature in support of his thesis, and so on. I stated, and again, in literature, you find some of this already, that there was a strong influence of Max Stirner, who wrote in the 1840s.
Stirner.
I also state the influence of Paul Rée. And I show exactly with the chapter names how they are very similar. They're like 10 or 15 chapter names, very similar between their works. Ré's works being published before Nietzsche, a couple of times, each of those. So I have to say, also considering what I found in the material, for example, I will tell you right away, he confided to the wife of a good friend of his, Franz Overbeck, that he, and I quote, had no actual philosophical ideas of his own. It might be shocking to some Nietzsche's followers. Ida Overbeck says he said this, no philosophical ideas of his own, but that he found if he simply persevered in philosophy, and made sure, and this is the key, to always be in opposition to currently held beliefs on the questions that he was tackling, he will make a name for himself, because this was indeed how it was always done. This was indeed how it was always done. She was convinced, studying intellectual history. And she said to be sure, he meant this neither as a joke nor as a provocation. This was indeed his method. Mm-hmm. I just recently found this out and I added it to the book and then I elaborated. And actually, if you look at it, he simply was, a lot of his positions are simply opposition to something else. And I think that was so to make him be apart, to be like an ultimately original thinker. When, if you think about it, to go back to your thesis, if you think about it, this critique of religion, critique of Christianity, questioning morality, some of his ideas on some of his, let's call it philosophy of history, critique of culture for being decadent, culture of his time, and even degenerated, find all of this in other authors. Some of them, generation before, you had the young Hegelians in the 1840s, Max Stirner, the main proponent in this regard, who Nietzsche had read. This, I think, is proven. I put in my book several pieces of evidence on that. Who is more radical than Nietzsche, actually, and more systematic. and elaborated better in one book. All of those ideas, sovereignty of the I, criticism of the state, of society, of religion, of the idea of God, of most of modern ideas, have already in 1845 in Stern. Have it to a certain extent in Karl Marx. So in that regard, I would say that Nietzsche largely was derivative and tried to make the impression that he was not. And how? With his rhetoric, his flamboyant phrases, bombastic phrases, as if he is revealing the deepest matters, this like intimate form of address. He always said these expressions, he talk about depth, like as if what he's saying is unfathomable depth. And then he would like not finish the thought even at time, but just will hint and so on. And sadly, because of that, you had generations of people who spent a lot of time laboring over his Zarathustra, for example.
Mm.
So much for this thesis.
Maybe that was his contribution, the ability to provoke thinking, the ability to trigger people into intellectual voyages. The ability, even if you're oracular, even if you're like an oracle, it's still a very useful social function or intellectual function. You force people to kind of decode you or solve the enigma, solve the riddle.
Yes, or you want me to reply on this? Yeah.
No, I'm wondering, maybe his originality is one aspect, arguable. He's a bit derivative, I agree. Although I'm not sure I would go as far as saying that all his work is derivative. I think he was not systematic. He was not methodical, and he was not, but I wouldn't rule. I would say there were sparks of originality in a few cases, but I think his main contribution to intellectual history was his ability to trigger a tsunami, an avalanche of intellectual analysis, intellectual pursuits, intellectual reframing, and so on and so forth, especially among the young in subsequent generations and for a very long time to this very day.
No, that's
catalyst. Catalyst. As a catalyst.
Yeah, that's true, but there is a big problem with his influence that was noticed already in the 1890s. This is nothing new. I've read at least 10 authors who wrote about him and warned people his influence and critically analyzed that which would be considered his philosophy, mostly his ethical philosophy, and stated some very valid critiques. And I think that actually I'm convinced, sadly, these critiques have been forgotten. It's a bit like in history when the winner, writes history, and then the alternative, dissenting points of views are forgotten to all except the persistent researchers of that particular time period. This is what I think happened with Nietzsche, because you have a number of authors who analyzed him in the 1890s when he became very popular. I will name a few names. Eduard von Hartmann, there was Otto Henne Amrin, little known author. There was Max Nodau. There was Ferdinand Tönnies, very important sociologist. Already then he was prominent, so he was already a serious author in his own right when he wrote his book on Nietzsche. So all of them are largely critical of him and of his influence. Now you say he might have sort of inspired people, especially young people, to think critically. There's a big problem with this, because his way of doing it was in a sort of in a rage. He was writing tirades. Pretty much every author he had an issue with, he wrote a tirade against Socrates, against Rousseau, several others, against Martin Luther, for example. And this is not the right approach, because especially in young people who have not read much, and especially if he is the first author that they read in philosophy, that can be a big problem. Not just because he is not only not systematic, he's anti-systematic. He does not state references. He regularly does not even try to prove anything, just state. So for young people who do not have developed critical thinking yet, and who do not have certain wealth of reading behind them from other authors, serious philosophers, like let's say Kant and Hegel in the German tradition, they can be enamored with this and find this normal and adopt it for their own thinking. And I've seen this, I have to say, online. So I have to say that his influence in that regard, I would I would consider it more negative,
Mm.
largely negative actually, and all because simply he does not promote actual research, he does not promote scholarly approach, and he's self-contradictory. Even in the same, you find on a number of positions he is self-contradictory. He actually, I think, promoted a certain maybe youthful rebellion. He's kind of vehicle for that, for youthful rebellion, sort of, but in a sense of you want to criticize, but you destroy everything. Because this is what he was doing actually. Tony's noticed this. He destroys objects that he wants to investigate. And this can be a big problem with young people, and I've met some people like that.
Well, we should not forget, I think, the context, the historical context in which he was operating. Rage, Weltschmerz, sorrow of the world. These were the only vehicles available to the young, starting with the transition from idealism to romanticism in Germany, you know. And he was a German. I mean, by spirit, he was a German. So we're talking about the German sphere of intellect. And the German sphere of intellect was founded on negative affects. It was founded on rage. It was founded on hatred. It was founded on envy. Whereas if you were to compare the German sphere, you mentioned Stirner. Stirner is no less aggressive, no less angry, no less rageful. If you were to compare the German sphere of intellectual discourse to, for example, the British, English more precisely, let alone the Scottish, or the Russian, the animating forces in these other spheres, in these other areas of the world, were not the same. Germans were motivated by these negative effects to this or that degree. Passion, even the use of passion, and Nietzsche is very passionate, yes. Even the use of passion is at the service of some form of destruction. You can see it in Wagner's work. You know, passion is never isolated, is never its own end. Passion is at the service. So Nietzsche has put a lot of passion into promoting nihilism, basically. Although Nietzsche claimed to be fighting nihilism, of course, he said that he's a biggest opponent of nihilism. He was warning against nihilism. He was the prophet of nihilism, in my view. he made it a household intellectual movement. And so what I'm trying to say, I think, is that you're right. I mean, I don't disagree. These are very angry texts, very passionate texts in the negative sense, and so on and so forth. But I think what I'm trying to say is that he was a child of his own era, a child of his own period. He is not that exceptional in this sense. You would be very hard pressed to find psychological texts, philosophical texts, I'm sorry, from that period, where the philosophy is measured and analytical and quiet, and like the British philosophers. So this is a German thing, what I'm saying. It's not a Nietzsche thing, it's a German thing. Second thing, you said that young people who were unequipped to deal with his writings because they lacked the depth and the breadth of prior education and so on and so forth. But we find people like Martin Buber. Martin Buber, you know, both of us would agree, is quite a deep thinker. And Buber claimed that one of his three main influences was Nietzsche. We find others whose mind I trust, others whose mind I think was sane and sound, and they were grounded, they were well educated, to use an understatement, yeah. And yet they did claim that Nietzsche was a major influence on them. That's why I suggested that he was a catalyst. Catalysts in chemical reactions are not a part of the reaction. They don't create anything new. They're just there. And by virtue of being there, they provoke a chemical reaction. I think that's more or less what Nietzsche has been. I agree with you that there's nothing groundbreaking or earth-shattering in his thinking, and there's nothing really very new, definitely. Anyone who knows the history of intellectual history of Europe in the 19th century, especially the German sphere, knows that he is imitative. But on the other hand, he popularized, he verbalized, he made it passionate. He made it accessible to younger audiences, especially, but not only. He was a bridge between. So when you accuse him of not having references, for example, I think he would have taken this as a compliment, because he was very much against philosophy, structured institutional philosophy. He thought that it was a form of decay, that it was a proof of decadence, a proof of death, anti-life. It was anti-life. So he chose to not be a scholar, I think. I don't think he ever claimed to be a scholar. I think he claimed to. No, I think, no, I mean, not early on. Early on, yes, he was very proud that he was appointed professor without this, without that. But I mean, later on in life, after the Basel years, he
You'll
was
find it.
more,
You'll find it even a bit later. I know.
yeah, because I always got the impression that he thought he was the world's, history's leading philosopher. Not necessarily a scholar of philosophy, but the world's leading philosopher. He even compared himself, at least twice that I'm aware of, to Socrates, as an anti-Socrates kind of figure. So this is megalomania. Yeah, this is megalomania, especially taking into account that throughout his life he has sold, to the best of my recollection, 400 copies, if I'm not mistaken. So, but I'm playing the devil's advocate, and I'm doing it on purpose, because it is very easy. Having read your book, it's very easy to dispense of him as an oddity, a collapsed narcissist who, lives in his own megalomaniacal space and rants and raves and what have you, and by sheer accident, because the period is sick, because civilization is sick, such a sick individual could have acquired this kind of resonance. It stands to reason that someone like Nietzsche would be a prominent philosopher in a period that is, in a civilization that is in its death throes, that is totally mentally ill, and so on, like our civilization nowadays. But I'm trying to see whether there was some value added to him.
There was, of course, but that is a separate topic. Some of these actually are essential ones. For example, his critique of the subject, or the idea of the unitary subject, that has certain merit. Although I didn't do enough research to check whether there were precedents in the history of philosophy to this as well. But you now opened several questions. Each of these could warrant a separate conversation. I wouldn't agree that predominant characteristic, or that among the dominant characteristics of the German intellectual tradition as it pertains to philosophy largely was envy and hatred. This is a separate question regarding the peculiarities of the German cultural development, because of them being delayed in relation to other major European nations and states like France and England. This is a separate topic, and a number of authors wrote about this. I read them. That they had that we could claim that there was a certain resentment because they were delayed in industrialization and urbanization, in terms of having a big urban center and having a big urban culture that can only be had if you have a Paris or a London-like city, which they only acquired late in the 19th century. Yeah, there is that. But of course, there are calm, sober, analytic, clear thinkers like Immanuel Kant. So that's
no. I must interrupt you. I was very clear. I was talking about the period of romanticism after idealism.
Okay, sorry. Yeah,
after Kant. Kant, yeah. I mean, idealism was okay. Idealism was British.
Yeah.
But you have afterwards. You have Schopenhauer. You have Nietzsche.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I got it. What you mean? Yes. There is definitely truth to that. Well, this is something we are going now into the territory of George Lukács, who wrote the book The Destruction of Reason, which I read and comment on in my book. And he would definitely agree with you, and he would say, this is what I researched. Thank you very much. 600 pages on this. He stated that this was the strong, maybe even dominant characteristic of the post-Hegelian German philosophy, definitely. That there were certain elements of this already in Schelling.
Yes.
So yes, we could say that, this is what is called irrationalism. Yeah, you could say the dark German romanticist strain. This is another interesting topic, in as much as Nietzsche wrote tirades against romanticism, against Rousseau, although he himself was also a romanticist.
Yeah.
This is that I added, sorry, recently to the book. So this was this mechanism of projection. So I interpreted this. Yeah, and now you say that in the time, yeah, there were definitely authors who talked about decadence, and maybe even who definitely also those who we could claim, and definitely the critics of decadence, for example, Max Nodau and some other authors, would have claimed they were degenerates, actually. He wrote the book, for example, Nodau wrote the book, Entartung, Degeneracy. Very, very nice title. 1,000 pages almost. And he treats Nietzsche in it as well, like 100 pages devoted to him. And he would have told you, yes, right on. This is what I was saying. Baudelaire, Ibsen, and so on, decadence, even degenerate, some of them, and so on. At the very least, problematic aesthetes, he called them. Yeah, so there was that, but I have to say also in that period of 1870s, 1880s, if I'm not mistaken, you also had then some of these, maybe that was a bit later, actually, to be honest, like neo-Kantianism. So like professor-like philosophy, professorial that were...
That's 1890. 1890.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, then yeah, there was some of that, but now, I don't know, maybe someone would find authors that were so full of rage, very often raving, really, in their writings, who had such a like a strong polemic tenor, to say the least. Now you mentioned also Max Stirner. He basically just one work of maybe 200 pages or so, and he stated, yeah, most of the critiques that Nietzsche stated, most of the things that Nietzsche criticized were already present there. And actually, I agree with those who state that he did it better, more clear.
I agree.
Elaborated better, more systematic, because he has a clear starting point of subjective idealism of the empirical eye, not the absolute eye of Fichte, but empirical eye. And he nicely draws conclusions from that. And I wouldn't say he was that rageful as Nietzsche. He didn't need to be. He simply followed this thought and laid waste, at everything in his path. And yeah, we could, of course, argue with him on that, but that he gave a very strong radical critique of most of modern ideas, actually. 40 years before Nietzsche, he did do that. Yes. And I have to say, Nietzsche really, that he never mentioned him. It was clear he read him. And I just that in the biographical material, there are a number of people who testify to that. Nietzsche telling him about Stirner, and people saying, yeah, he recommended to me Max Stirner's work and so on. But that I added to my book a number of places in Stirner that could very nicely fit in Nietzsche's works, especially Genealogy of Morals and some of the other later works.
Yes. Yes. Okay. The main thesis of your book is that Nietzsche was a collapsed narcissist. And what you seem to be saying, by the way, pretty clearly, it's a readable book. It's really nice. I read it in one go. But what you seem to be saying is that the mental condition of Nietzsche, alleged mental condition, because we can't interview him, nor would we want to, I think, but his mental condition has informed substantially his work. In other words, there was no divorce, but his mental condition pushed him to engage in a highly specific type of selection of topics and presentation, ways of presentation, and so on. His whole work was shaped by an extension, or is a reflection, or something like that, as an intimate connection with his mental condition. Obviously, initially, what you're saying is that he was driven to do all this because he was a narcissist, but then, increasingly more so, I think I got the impression, at least, that even his work was informed by his narcissism. If I'm wrong, feel completely free to disagree and correct me right now. It's an opportunity. What is it that you are saying? That he embarked on this path of self-aggrandizement and self-glorification and so on because he was a narcissist, but his work had nothing to do with his narcissism? Or are you saying that his narcissism informed both his life choices and his work?
Well, I definitely do not say that the most of his work can be understood as the outgrowth or as consequence of his narcissism in its content. To a certain extent, in its form, yes, in what I say in the chapter on his writing style and in his, of course, grandiose phrases. And now I primarily talk about his personality, and I wanted to explain, and that was actually the starting point. I didn't think much about his work when I started started the research, and when I did the first draft. I was primarily interested in his personality, his relation, because as I said, I got the idea watching your lectures, and I already had read by that point, long time ago, everything he said for publishing, and a couple of tomes of his nachlass, some of his letters as well, and a number of books on him, biographical and on his work. So I was well acquainted with him. And I made several connections quickly, and then I started writing, and I saw there was more and more the more I investigated. So primarily it is about his personality, and I primarily state that, as I state in the introduction, and then also repeat that in the conclusion, that his relationships with others, his self-perception, his opinion of himself in his work, to a large extent his lifestyle are to be understood through his narcissism, and can only be understood based on the thesis that he was a narcissist. Because I will tell you why. There were many people who wrote about him. I've read around probably 30 books on him and his work, and thousands of pages of source biographical material. And you have a number of authors who know these certain things. Of course, already in the 1890s, even earlier, 1870s, 80s, know this grandiosity. Even a layman would notice that.
Yeah.
So even in early works, some know this, and I say that in the book. By the later works, so from Zarathustra onwards, even a layman would know that. They called it in German, Größenwahn, so mania of greatness. They didn't have the concept of narcissism, so they couldn't develop that further. So that remained a necessarily partial insight. But the issue is that the treatment of him, he says it will end in 10 minutes, so we will start again, I guess, the meeting.
Yeah, we can click on the thing.
Yeah, so the issue is that even in some books written in past 30, 40 years, still regarding his personality, his lifestyle, his problematic relationship with others, still the biographers would state, there was such a grandiosity. Yes, he was pressured as a child to be a scholar by his mother and sister. That is not good. That was not normal. So therefore, that affected him later on. But these are partial insights. And narcissism gives us a system within which these have their place, but a number of other things as well, like narcissistic injury, like projection, like the itinerant lifestyle, like the use of drugs as well. And so this is what I'm saying. So it's my thesis explains, this is what I claim, his lifestyle, relationships with others, self-understanding, and his opinion of his own work. And actually can only be properly understood based on that. This is fully understood, based correctly and fully based on the thesis. Now, when it comes to his work, the thing is, he often talked about himself in his work, explicitly and implicitly.
Yes.
Explicitly, of course, we have Ecce Homo, where he talks about why am I so smart, why do I write such good books? I mean, but even in Beyond Good and Evil, you notice that it must be autobiographical, or it can be inferred. It can be inferred that it is autobiographical if you know him well, if you know his biography well. That would be explicit or close to explicit, and implicitly, for example, in terms of projection. Because when he talks about others, other authors, he's talking about himself. He's incredible. He is so. I realized that he was actually, if you know about narcissism and about the mechanisms at play in that condition, you realize he's talking about himself. This is what I added recently about Rousseau, about Socrates. He's projecting. He says Rousseau, that moral tarantula, Rousseau, that romanticist, he was to blame for the excesses of the French Revolution. I mean, all it is not supported. Again, no literature. How can you claim that? Okay. But then you see that what he reproaches him with, you could also say about Nietzsche. Same things. how he, in his tirade against Socrates in Twilight of the Idol, again, which is completely unsupported, all of the things that he states, but you realize he says Socrates was a decadent. What else did he say?
Yeah, that's why I said earlier that he was actually comparing himself with Socrates. He was anti-Socratic, but
he said Socrates had an anarchy. There was an anarchy in his instincts and so on. And I said, well, that was in your instincts.
The sound is off. The sound is off.
Now?
Now it's okay. Now it's okay.
Yeah. So he's saying Socrates had an anarchy in his instincts, blah, blah. You had anarchy in your instincts. You did drugs, possibly also cocaine, chloral, opium, and so on, alcohol. You moved from city to city every 2 or 3 months. Is that not anarchy? You changed study subjects. You thought about changing careers several times. Your relationships with others are anarchical. I mean, what are you talking? You're talking about yourself. Clear projection. And also how he accused others of being decadent, like Socrates and Rousseau, of course, but then Wagner, then who else? Jesus, Martin Luther, and so on. He was a decadent. He himself said it. And when he says, yes, it's true, I was a decadent, but I chose things. I didn't go towards things that would harm me. And this is what the real decadent does. For him, decadence is when you go towards things that harm you. And I say, sorry, did it help you that you took chloral when other people told you that it's bad for your mental state? Did it help you when you were drinking alcohol and you had stomach problems and you were decrying the use of alcohol, the drinking of beer? It's also hypocritical. So it's not true even that he was not a decadent, even according to his definition. As Edward von Hartmann noted, and I expounded on this, in analysis of what Nietzsche said about Wagner, also about Wagner, there was also a projection there. He says Nietzsche was a decadent according to his own words, that the word comes out of the sentence. Sentence sort of overflows in a paragraph in a page, and so on. Chaos in relation between the parts and the whole. Those are his writings. Aphorism, sentences that can stand on their own. Those are his writings.
But aphorisms, for example, aphorisms are a venerable literary tradition in philosophy. Even up to the 60s, you had Guy Debord, The Society of the Spectacle. It's written in aphorisms, So the choice of aphorisms is not necessarily indicative of a chaotic mind. It might be a literary convention of the period.
But according to his own definition, Sam, that is the thing, because he says, what is decadence? That the parts gain life at the expense of the whole.
Yes.
And he put some, he talked in this metaphorical way, atoms, anarchy of atoms, whatnot. But even he says this, that the word sort of, how to say it in English, that the word is bigger than the sentence bigger than the paragraph bigger than the paper. Is what you have in him, actually. That is his style. That is part and parcel, as they say, of his own style. It's incredible that he didn't know this. So, and Edward von Hartmann noticed this. He wrote about the philosophy of the unconscious. I think he was also a decent enough psychologist to notice this. So you see, to that extent, as I said, my main thesis pertains to his personality and relationships with others, lifestyle and biography. Secondarily, also to his work. In the content, yes, to a certain extent, in the form as well. Yeah, a bit more, perhaps even more in the form. But then again, this can also not be entirely separated, the form and the content.
Yes, we'll come to it in the second part. It's okay. Yeah. I'm recording.
Yeah.
So I would like to discuss 2 issues with you in this second half, or maybe more, but we'll start with 2. The first issue is the following. Narcissistic personality disorder, pathological narcissism, is not merely about self-enhancement. Look what, I'm the greatest philosopher that has ever lived. I'm revolutionizing cultural theory and, philosophy and so on. Those are grandiose statements, but they are not necessarily indicative of narcissism. Narcissism involves much more profound issues, such as cognitive distortions, inability to perceive reality appropriately, impaired reality testing, and so on and so forth. Do you believe it is possible for a narcissist, in this sense, in this extended sense, do you really believe it's possible for a narcissist to create a body of work that is insulated from his narcissism, that is not affected by his narcissism in any way, shape, or form? These biases, these distortions, this divorce from reality, the fantasy defense, all these things.
Well, I have to say, I could answer that only sort of theoretically because I haven't done so much research.
No, apply to Nietzsche. When you have read Nietzsche and so on.
He definitely, I go into this in my book in the chapter Trend of Changes in Nietzsche's Life and Thought. And he was very much had the habit of dichotomous thinking. And this corresponds to what you called also black and white thinking. So black and white thinking or dichotomous thinking. This was a strong habit of his, and this is very present in his work from the beginning. I mean, think of the Apollonian-Dionysian opposition. Think of the whole range of oppositions, often personalized, interestingly, like Dionysus, Socrates, master morality, slave morality, Napoleon, Jesus, Cesare Borgia, and then, I don't know, someone else who he found to be like a proponent of the slave morality. What else? Distinguished high culture, low culture, and all of this. And in this sense, he did distort reality, I would say. Because, I mean, just look at the genealogy of moral. This is the only work of his life period that has somewhat of a character of treatise. And this is the go-to work if you want to sort of in a somewhat coherent way, espouse Nietzsche's so-called philosophy. And you see that already, you see in that work, master-slave morality opposition. And I mean, he doesn't prove there anything. Again, it's largely a fantastic account of his idea of prehistory. This is, of course, a separate topic, critique of this work. It was criticized by several authors, I think, with some valid critiques. But there are a number of these oppositions. Just take a look. Some of them I already mentioned. Yes, I'll tell you here. Contrariness.
I agree. His work is very splitting. It's all.
Yes, it's very
all something. Oh.
Yeah. And just take a look. Oh, yes. So, for example, the noble versus the ascetic priest, Napoleon versus the Christian idea, individualistic Renaissance man versus the specialized modern scientist, tragic worldview versus Socratic rationality. Sorry, but who says that this holds water? Such reasoning. Who says there was not some tragic thinking in Socrates, something rational in this Dionysian orientation, whatever. So these are largely constructions. I think it would be too much to call them theoretical because they don't have much of a character of a theory.
I agree.
More to say that. So what they also show is, and again, to go back to what you said in relation of narcissism to perception of reality and then how that is reflected in the work, he shows a complete disregard of a number of aspects of modern life. For example, economy. You cannot find almost any economic consideration in his work related to industry, which is what characterized his epoch. He grew up in it. He should have known it intimately. By the time of the 1880s came along, it was already the first stages of the second industrial revolution. There were already first phones being installed, first cities getting some amount of electricity and electrical devices. It's unbelievable that he still thought of reality, social reality, historical reality, that in his considerations related to philosophy of history and philosophy of culture, he remained on these positions of these oppositions, these dualisms, this dichotomous thinking, which were then also personalized. Incredible. So he didn't think in terms of social, for example, social classes, social groups, economic dynamics, how that affected social groups, how that affected culture and morality and so on. I mean, just to claim, like in the generality of morals, it's very simplified what he claims there, and actually preposterous largely. And you see that he didn't even attempt to try to make a study to provide support for this. Okay, how exactly did slave morality make this so-called uprising in the area of morality? Where? At which points do we find this? Which were the deciding points? He says simply, the Jews, that people of priests, made their revenge against the noble Roman, the aristocratic type, by crucifying Jesus, by publicly denying him, renouncing him, and they tricked the world in this way to accept their slave morality, and that became the dominant one. And here we are still in the throes of that. That is preposterous. There were people already in the 1890s laughing about it. They would, you see, for example, in Max Nordau, okay, I will now take this seriously for the purpose of critique. Just so you know, I am not really taking it seriously. Then he shows in a few pages how preposterous this is, that you have such morality of compassion in the previous doctrines, like from the Far East, like in Buddhism and so on, that were, whose proponents were noblemen, sons of kings, no lowlifes of the ancient world. And there are a number of other problems with this. It's really a preposterous thesis that he has there. And I think that really that work should have been published with an extensive commentary.
Now, you raised some fascinating points. I would like to add a few dimensions as briefly as I can, because I have two additional questions now. Used to be one, but now it's two. The first comment I would like to make, it is as if Nietzsche has been totally isolated from the ferment, from the intellectual developments of his age. In his lifetime, modern psychology was being born, especially in Paris. You had figures like Janet, Charcot, and so on. People like Sigmund Freud traveled all the way from Vienna to Paris to study, and modern Wundt in Germany established a laboratory, and so on. Psychology was not perceived initially as the study of the human mind. It was actually initially perceived as a study of biology or neurology or whatever, and the foundation of civilization. Like, the idea was that if you decipher the biology of the organism, you also decipher the organization, what we call social organization of the organism. So to ignore this when you are writing about history, and most definitely morality, which is a psychological construct, to ignore this is pretty astounding. When you, by comparison, read work written by Freud about Moses, about the concept of the taboo, about, you see that Freud's thinking is extremely wide, extremely expansive. It takes in sociology, anthropology, history. I mean, you name it. You can disagree with Freud, as I do, but that's not the issue. The issue is that Freud was open to all the influences of his period, whereas Nietzsche is not. He doesn't mention a single thing from the field of psychology. Similarly, already in his lifetime, Marxism was a force to contend with, to use an understatement. And capitalism was already becoming an ideology with philosophies to back it up. And yet there is no hint or mention. And of course, there is a rigorous connection between morality and property. I mean, numerous scholars, to ignore economics or homo economicus as a player, as an agent in all these, in history, in morality, is astounding. His work is solipsistic in this sense, utterly intellectually solipsistic. It's as if he has chosen 1-2 elements of a very compounded picture and then insisted that these elements are the picture, and there's nothing but these elements, and so on. So I am not impressed by my work, and I'm sorry if you got the opposite impression, because I'm trying to play the devil's advocate. I am not impressed by his work, not because he uses aphorisms, I don't mind. Guy Debord's work, for example, is very profound, and he uses aphorisms. Not because he doesn't have references. I'm not impressed by references, although they are good practice, of course, but okay, that's not the main issue. But I am not impressed by his work because the man was not curious. I know it sounds crazy, but Nietzsche was not a curious person. Absolutely not. He reminds me of my lawyer. I had a lawyer, one of the leading lawyers in Israel, Ram Kaspi, and once I went to him, I was his client, and I said to him, listen, I have this and this, and look at this. I have receipts, I have this. He said, Sam, stop. I have made up my mind. Don't confuse me with the facts. This was Nietzsche, more or less. And I would even say I hold in contempt such people, because when you close yourself to inputs from the outside, especially when you're an intellectual, that is a sign of decadence and decay as an intellectual, And that is the difference between a true intellectual and an ideologue, for example. People who come up with ideologies, that's exactly what they do. Nationalist ideologies, for example, racist ideologies. This is exactly what they do. Okay, here's the questions I wanted to ask you. He grew up on both sides, mother and father, in highly religious households. And that is, again, a bit of an understatement. Yeah? Highly religious. And yet he is perceived to have rebelled against religion and so on and so forth. Is this a personal thing? Or do you think it is an inexorable intellectual development?
Well, I think that the consensus of biographers is that that was a part of his personal development, also intellectual, that he had a crisis of religious faith when he was about, I think, 2021, when he left theology study, because he started to study theology based on the wish of his mother to become a pastor, Protestant pastor, like his father was. And he left that after 2 semesters, and that was connected to a crisis of faith, probably with the readings of Stirner and Schopenhauer, either or, maybe both, because he read them exactly at this time in 1864-65. So yeah, this is, and I agree with this. But then later on, of course, again, we have problematic elements in his work also pertaining to his view of the history of religion and his criticism of Christianity, because he takes a certain orthodox form of Christianity, not as in Eastern Orthodoxy, but Orthodox in terms of strictness of morality and demands and so on. And then he wages war against that. But some commentators noted that, but by this time already there have been different doctrines in Christianity developed that were not like that. And for whom were you writing such rabid tirades and polemics? The Orthodox will not listen to you anyway, and your more enlightened readers do not need this. So he there constructed a certain enemy, of which there was not so much any longer in reality of his time and in the space for which he was writing, Central Europe largely. So that is also
a straw man. A straw man.
Yeah, somewhat of a straw man. That is true. And of course, his perception of the history of religion is also problematic. For example, he claims that Protestantism killed Renaissance. Then you have an author who says, look, you have a number of artists and scholars who were, humanists who were Protestant in German. So how can this be true? And because, there were people when he became famous, sometime in 1889, and then many people took up aspects of his writing and went with it and uncritically praised it. there were people who were more educated than him in pretty much each of the areas he wrote in, and who then critically evaluated his work, found many problems with it, many holes, many places where there is no evidence, and many places where he simply he misconstrues reality. It's unbelievable. That is connected, I think, to dichotomous thinking. Dichotomous thinking and this sort of despotic, even dogmatic way in which he often proceeded. This is all from Zarathustra onwards. In the middle period, he was this skeptical, enlightenment-like thinker, with very fine observations, sharp-minded. And in this period, there are works that I like and I enjoyed reading, and they still have a significant merit. But everything from Zarathustra onwards is full of this rage and this misconstrued views of reality, historical and current.
Now, in constriction, the fact that he was not exposed, in my view, at least, he was not exposed to a wide range of intellectual traditions or works. Another thing I think as a narcissist that he would do in his personal life is that he would idealize and then devalue people. Wagner, of course, is the number one example. But not only Wagner. In your book, I've read about his relationship with his friends and so on and so forth. Even his sister. So it was a phase of idealization, devaluation. And would you like to talk a bit about this?
Yes, well, of course. This is one of my main arguments because, according to your teaching, this is essential for a narcissist and dominates. It's a structure which unfolds, which governs their relationships with pretty much everyone with whom they have somewhat of a significant relationship. Idealization, devaluation, discard, and then attempt at separation, individuation. Yeah, I followed your work.
Yes, I do. Yeah. Thank you.
And definitely, I found it with Wagner, with Lou Salome, with Paul Rey, to an extent with Erwin Rode. He didn't have so many personal relationships of note. So these were some of the most important ones.
Can you pick up on Wagner?
On Wagner, it is stated, he says it himself in some of his letters. You see idealization. He says the world does not comprehend the size of his nature, the singularity of his nature. His work is beyond comprehension. His closeness is my consolation. Then you find this singer Lily Lehmann, who says in her memoirs, sometimes I would sit with Friedrich Nietzsche in some quiet corner in Bayreuth, probably in the 1870s, and he would talk to me about Wagner's great knowledge, about the sources from which he drew. She says, in a quiet voice, but very serious. And you find later, of course, tirades against him, 2 works in 88, as if one was not enough, but even earlier, saying that Wagner is a decadent, that his art is sick. And all of this, again, projection that suddenly everything that he respected about Wagner now is wrong. All of his operas are signs of decadence. He is poisoning people.
That's pretty amazing. Very early on, Nietzsche suggested that Wagner is resuscitating or reviving the Dionysian tradition.
Yeah.
And then he attacked him for this very thing in his pamphlet or book, or whatever you want to call it, the case Wagner. He attacked him exactly for this, for being too passionate, for being too... It's pretty amazing because the same material is used to idealize and then to devalue the same person. It's pretty... And he's not aware. Like, we are not talking a difference of 70 years. We're talking like, not long. And he's not aware that he's using the same materials. But it's the same. Sometimes it's the same words. It's pretty shocking. Yeah.
But that's something called persuasive definition. This is from metaethics. I think the author is called Stevenson. That is when you take a certain term which has a certain emotional connotation, and then you put a certain value predicate there that you want. So if he says that Socrates was a decadent, Socrates was a decadent. Decadence is something bad. And he makes the notion such so that it fits, supposedly. And then the same for Rousseau and so on. So this was a bit, you see, content independent. We could say whatever the content, he can put a negative or a positive value sign in front of it.
But the same content, the
Yeah,
same.
same content. Yeah.
The passion that rendered Wagner neo-Dionysian, a few years later, rendered him decadent. This passion, this very passion,
Yeah.
the same. I mean,
Yeah,
I remember at the time I found it shocking.
yeah, for kind of, it's like a critique of romanticism again. You know,
Yeah.
although he himself, one author, Julius Harp, noticed this nicely that he himself was a romanticist because he also advocated for a return of a culture of an earlier time, 17th century Renaissance, ancient Greece and Rome, and he wanted to get away from his own time because he found it decadent and even degenerate in certain respects. But what is more romanticist than that?
He is absolutely a romanticist. I mean, it's been, in my view, beyond debate. His father died when he was a kid, I think 5 years old, if I remember.
Not even 5, 4
Something
something.
5 or something, yeah. His father died. He was a pastor. He was a religious person. And then he spent the rest of his life with women. I mean, the rest of his
Childhood
and some adolescence with women, which was essentially his mother, two aunts, sister, and so on and so forth. Do you believe this might have had any impact on him? Psychologically speaking, we are talking all about psychology right now.
Yeah, well, a number of authors made this connection, and I think it could have played a part in his later hatred of women, his misogyny, which is like open for everyone to see, which was open for everyone to see, and still is in his works. But this is, of course, related then also to narcissism. Especially, you say, I claim that he was a cerebral narcissist, and you say yourself, cerebral narcissists generally are misogynists because of how they developed into narcissists, and this had to do with the mother. And then, of course, they will have animosity towards the mother, mostly subconscious, but then expressed in the relations with women. And the added fact that not only that he grew up, as I claim, to be a narcissist, and in that sense, there was a reason for his animosity towards his own mother, but that he lived in a household with, I think, 6 women. Now, of course, there's the question, is a father figure needed or not? You say it's not, but maybe then it was. Who knows, because the sexes were different. Of course, there were early on authors who sort of latched onto this and said, well, look how effeminate he was later on in life. He was not a proper man. Look, all of this, he talks to us about his stomach problems in his works and whatnot. I mean, come on, man up.
And yet he volunteered to military duty. I mean, first he was recruited, but second time he volunteered. So he was a man's man. He has one of the greatest mustaches in the 19th century. I mean, that's a man's man for you.
He was a medic in the war. He was a medic because he was not allowed. I think he was not even allowed to be, or was not. I think he was not allowed because he already took the Swiss citizenship, and then I think the Swiss citizenship disallowed. So Switzerland disallowed its citizens to take part in foreign wars because he had to take the Swiss citizenship to be a professor there. He could not be a combatant, but he was a medic. No, that is true, definitely. But to go back to this question related to being raised by women in that time, in that largely still patriarchal, male authoritarian culture, just a number of authors also mentioned this as something which had a detrimental effect on him as a man. And possibly also related to his then later view of women, which was negative.
Mm-hmm. We have something in psychology, clinical psychology, which is much debated. You could call it psychotic grandiosity. Psychotic grandiosity is a delicious cocktail between narcissism, pathological narcissism, and psychosis. The key feature of psychosis is known as hyperreflexivity. Hyperreflexivity is when your ego becomes the world, yourself becomes, you expand outwards, and you absorb the totality of the world. From that moment, whatever is happening in your mind is happening also outside in the world. It's a form of magical thinking, but as distinct from magical thinking, it doesn't involve cognition. It's just the way you are. That's how you see it. So if there's a voice in your head, it will be coming from the outside. If there's an image, it will be That's hallucinations and so on and so forth. Very often when I read Nietzsche, I get a powerful impression of psychotic grandiosity, not only narcissism, but kind of expansion of the self to an obliteration of boundaries, so that he is like all over the place. He is the world. He is absorbing the world. You can find it in religious writings. It's politically incorrect to say, but I think Jesus was like that. When there is a confusion between the world and yourself. Many of the grandiose statements of Nietzsche are not about his work, not about himself, but about his mastery of history, his redirection of the world, his cosmic mission, his kind of cosmic mission. Of course, you find it in Adolf Hitler, in many of the speeches, and also in parts of Mein Kampf. You find this as well. So I think Nietzsche was not merely a megalomaniac, but he felt that his life was not his own. His life was kind of cosmically ordained. He was more a prophet, I think, than an intellectual or a scholar. He was more, ironically, a religious figure, establishing a new religion, perhaps a Dionysian religion, yeah, but a new religion, a religion of masters, the master race or race of masters, not the slaves, Dionysus and not Apollonius. He is establishing a new, and in this sense, he was a kind of messiah. I think he had a messianic self-concept. Therefore, I think, and so it's not an accident and not a mistake that it is thus spake Zarathustra and not, I don't know, some other character from history, thus spake Socrates. Why not thus spake Socrates, because there are strong religious overtones and undertones where the prophet Nietzsche is leading us all to the promised land of unbridled, unbounded self-interest, force of life, rationality, master mentality, and self-determination, in effect, because the Übermensch self-determines rules and laws and everything, determines its own environment. And that's why I asked you about religion, because I think he came full circle. He started in a Lutheran household and so on. Then he escaped. He thought he escaped. But I think he came back full circle, only this time he made himself God. He made himself a prophet.
Yes, if you look at what he said about some of his writings, and I say this in the book, in the chapter on grandiosity, he said, for example, about his Zarathustra, that it is the most important book of all times and people, and should be published in 1 million copies and translated into 7 languages at once and spread all over the earth. And then further on, he says, my Zarathustra was here the highest act. Compared with it, everything from all the big souls before is nothing. And then you see poets of the Vedas, Goethe, Shakespeare, and so on. Extreme grandiosity. And yes, he said that if I do not strive so far that in the future generations place their highest vows on my name, then I have, in my eyes, achieved nothing. For me, this is, I rest my case. I put that at the beginning of the chapter, and then from then on, the reader knows.
Which leads to the final question. He succeeded. His influence is massive. Here we are talking about him. You have read 30 books about him. How many other historical figures you spend time reading 30 books about? No? So to a large extent, he has succeeded. To what do you attribute his lasting influence? One could be influential within a space of 10, 20, 30 years. Sartre, for example, I'm not quite sure is influential nowadays. I'm not. I know, people read him, analyze him, but I'm not quite sure that he's as influential. However, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and so on, they're pretty influential. To what do you attribute his lasting influence beyond the confines of his historical period, context, culture, and so on?
Yeah, I thought about this recently, and this, of course, can be a topic for a separate study, and I'm sure there are some. What I came up with are several elements. One is that the early critiques this I mentioned in the first part of the conversation, early critiques were largely forgotten. When I looked them up, I usually had to go to the original editions or some published just a few years later, still in the 19th century or the first decade of the 20th century. I had to go, read them in the library. You cannot take it out or look it up in the Internet Archive. But that showed me already that for most of these works, there were no further reprints, not even after the First World War, let alone the Second. So I think the early critiques, which have a number of valid points, when it comes to critique of the content from a scientific philosophical standpoint and historical, his thesis, and this in terms of psychopathological, although they didn't know about narcissism then, so as I said, it was quite partial what was stated in that regard. Then there is also the aspect of the fascination of a supposed insane genius. The idea is that insanity could perhaps, in those that are also creative, like he was, allow certain insights that people who are psychologically more or less normal and not clinically insane cannot gain. And this is I think this is one of the most important elements, because so many people, even if you give them a rational reason, some of which I stated and a number of his critiques stated and elaborated on, might think, yes, but what if he saw further? What if he knew things that we didn't? And that is why his works were like that. That is why he went insane fully, because the scale of those truths was such that you couldn't remain normal. And then how are you going to argue against this? This is really difficult. So that is another element. There is also the element that he was ahead of his time. And this plays into people's narcissistic tendencies, I have to say, because then being a follower of his, you make yourself to be avant-garde. Then each generation of readers, they find themselves to be avant-garde because they're supposedly followers of a writer who is ahead of his time, always. So he was ahead of his time supposedly in the 1880s, 1890s, 1910, 1930. I mean, how long will he be ahead of his time? When will that time come? And one author says, when the world goes crazy, then there will be the time for his philosophy. Then we will know. Once the time comes for his philosophy, that the world succumbs to madness. Yeah, there is that, and there is also the element that many critiques, this is also something that I saw online, you state certain critiques, they will tell you, you misunderstood him. Okay, is there any critique that can be voiced about his works, which is not an effect of him being misunderstood, or not a consequence of malice? And this is because of the fragmentary character of his work, because he contradicts himself, and then you can take isolated pieces and construe a certain worldview, and you can construe several mutually exclusive worldviews. And then even his followers argue then, look at, he said this, and then someone put a quote, look, this refuses or this contradicts. And they're like, what to do now? No. And then another quote. And then this was also noticed early. So most of these things related to his influence was noted early on. That, I mean, sorry, but if he's always misunderstood, who is to blame for that? And what does that say about those writings? I mean, clearly, he was not, they were not clear enough, his teachings in his own mind. Otherwise, on paper, they would have been more clear. And why did he publish it then if it was so easy to be misunderstood? And even he himself said said certain things about how he dislikes, being understood and so on. There are places where he even goes against reason, against providing reasons. He says in his tirade against Socrates, what about this providing reasons? The distinguished soul doesn't need that. The great man doesn't need to provide reasons. I mean, this megalomania. But I think this is narcissistic depreciation, because he himself mostly did not provide reasons. He then depreciated that at a meta level.
Mm-hmm. And do you think he's channeling current day narcissism and current day rage, anger, global anger, universal anger, and so on?
One of the elements next to this that I mentioned in his lasting and at times kind of revived popularity or increased popularity is definitely the narcissistic tendencies in his readers, because really, if you read him and these things that he says about how there are the distinguished people and then there is the herd, and if you continue reading the works in which he says this, and these are his major works, and you have a largely positive view of his works, well, then this is symptomatic, because which normal person, I mean, only people who are very, very accomplished would have a right then to side on the side of distinguished and say, yeah, I agree, I am like that. But the large majority of people in all times and all places are not particularly accomplished. So therefore, readers, most of his readers get a sense of being something grand, although they are not, they don't have the accomplishments for that, not even close, but vicariously through his writings, and then even adopt that standpoint, like kind of Nietzsche gave me the okay to be like this, and then simply seem obnoxious, and then even some of them seem to be personally offended when you criticize Nietzsche's works.
It's a cult. It's a cult.
They're narcissistically invested, and already in the 1890s, there were several works called Nietzsche Cult, on the Nietzsche Cult, and now again we have a Nietzsche Cult, actually, because they have little tolerance for dissent, and even some of them seem to experience narcissistic injury if you criticize their master.
And this is religion. And everything you describe put together is religion. In religious texts, no exception, you have contradictions, multiple contradictions, so you can always find the right verse to support your cause. This is especially notorious in the Quran. In the Quran, you have numerous contradictions, but there is a principle in Islam that says the latest version overrides and overrules the previous version. So at least you have this. But in the New Testament, Old Testament, Rig Veda, you name it, in all religious and quasi-religious texts, you have multiple contradictions. The ambiguity and fuzziness, Nostradamus type, Nostradamus, Nietzsche is a kind of intellectual Nostradamus, He makes these statements that can be interpreted in at least 19 different ways on a good day. So he's always right, and so on. But all these elements, if you put them together, they actually describe a secular religion. And perhaps this is the biggest irony in his life. I think he ended up inspiring the herd, the slaves, not the masters. The Nazis were the quintessence of slaves because they were a victimhood movement. Nazis were a victimhood movement. They were absolutely slaves by definition, by self-identity. So the revenge of history when it comes to Nietzsche is that he's influenced the herd and the slaves, not as he had hoped maybe, the masters and that's, I think, where we will end our conversation. It was fascinating. Pity about the sound. I hope people will overcome this, because you have said many interesting things and I would not like them to miss it. Again, this is the book. I've read it in one go. Doesn't happen a lot. And it's Nietzsche's Narcissism, but you can learn as much about Nietzsche as about narcissism. So it's on Amazon, I understand?
Yes, on Amazon.
I wrote a foreword, and I believe in later editions you have the foreword.
Yeah, it's there.
Fully recommended, wholeheartedly. Fascinating read. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you. Take care.
See you. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye-bye.